Hey, what's up, y'all? This is Iskosi of Fun Day. Back for you and for yours, checking in, doing these videos, doing Black History. That's what we do. And this one's gonna be a new series. I'm starting off in the book of Carter G. Woodson, the Honorable Carter G. Woodson, A Century of the Negro Migration. It's a very good read, as you're gonna find out. I'm probably gonna do a chapter a day on this. You know what I'm saying? But Carter G. Woodson talked about some real good stuff in here that need to be discussed, and I don't think it's not really being discussed because Black scholarship is being lost and abused right about now. You know what I'm saying? Because a lot of cats just coming up with their own thing. But I read from people that have been there and they're there. Now, as you see what it looked like. This is the book cover look like. There's many book covers to this one. But this one I decided to focus on right here, showing Carter G. Woodson in the Century of Negro Migration. All right. As it says right here in the corner, in the Century of Negro Migration, Carter G. Woodson. And we're going to start out with chapter 1, Finding a Place of Refuge. Migration of the blacks from the southern states to those offering them better opportunities is nothing new. The objective here, therefore, will not merely present the evidence of the causes and results of the recent movement of the Negroes to the north, but to connect this event with periodical movements of the blacks to that section from about the year of 1815 to the present day. That this movement should date from that period indicates the policy of the Commonwealths toward the Negroes had then begun decidedly to differ so as to make one section of the country seem more congenial to the despised blacks than the other. As a matter of fact, to justify this conclusion, we need to give a passing mention here to developments too well known to be discussed in detail. Slavery in the original 13 states was the normal condition of the Negroes. When, however, James Otis, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson began to discuss the natural rights of the colonists, then said to be oppressed by Great Britain, some of the patriots of the Revolution carried their reason into the logical conclusion, contending that the Negro slaves should be free on the same grounds as their rights were, also founded in the laws of nature. And so it was soon done in most northern commonwealths. Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts exterminated the institution by constitutional provisions. In Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania by gradual emancipation acts. And it was thought that the institution would soon thereafter pass away, even in all the southern commonwealths except South Carolina and Georgia, where it becomes seemingly profitable. There came later an industrial revolution following the invention of the Watt steam engine and the mechanical applications like Whitley's Scotland gin, all which changed the economic aspects of the modern world, making slavery an institution offered by means of exploitation to those engaged in the production of cotton. This revolution rendered necessary a large supply of cheap labor for cotton culture, out of which the plantation system grew. Negro slaves therefore lost all hope of ever winning their freedom in South Carolina and Georgia, and in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, where the sentiment in favor of abolition had been favorable. There was a decided reaction which soon blighted their hopes. In the Northern Commonwealth, however, the sentiment on behalf of universal freedom, though at times dormant, was ever apparent despite the attachment of the South of the trading classes of the northern cities, which profited by the slave trade and their commencement with slave-holding states. The northern states maintained this liberal attitude, developed, therefore into an asylum for Negroes who were oppressed in the South. The Negroes, however, were not generally welcome in the North, so they didn't want the black people there anyway. Many of the Northerners who sympathized with the oppressed blacks in the South never dream of having them as their neighbors. They were consequently always two classes of anti-slavery people: those who advocated for abolition of slavery to elevate the blacks to dignity of citizenship, and those who merely hoped to exterminate the institution because it was an economic evil. The latter generally believed that blacks constituted an inferior class that could not discharge the duties of citizenship. And when the proposal to incorporate the blacks into the body politics was clearly present to those agitators, their anti-slavery ardor was decidedly dampened. Unwilling, however, to take the position that a race should be doomed because of personal objections, many of the early anti-slavery groups looked towards colonization for a solution of this problem. Some thought of Africa, but since deportation of large numbers of persons who have been brought under the influence of modern civilization seemed cruel, the most popular colonization scheme at first seemed to be that of selling the Negroes on the public lands in the West, as this region has been lately seceded. However, no one can determine what good use can be made of it by white men. No such policy was generally accepted. When this territory was seceded to the United States in an effort to apply for the government, it finally culminated in a proposed ordinance of 1784, carrying out the provisions that slavery should not exist in the Northwest Territory after the year 1800. So slavery was there. Just as a sidebar, slavery was there in the Northwest Territory. They said it should not exist to the 1800. That's when they're going to stop it. This measure finally failed to pass, and unfortunately, too, thought some, because had slavery had been given 16 years to grow on that soil, it might have been not been abolished there until the Civil War, or might have caused such a preponderance of slave commonwealths as to make the rebellion successful. The Ordinance of 1874 was an antecedent to a more important Ordinance of 1787, which carried the famous sixth article that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, should exist in that territory. At first, it was generally deemed made feasible to establish Negro colonies on that domain. Yet, despite the issuance of the Ordinance of 1787, conditions were such that one could not determine exactly whether the Northwest Territories would be slave or free. What then was the situation in this partly unoccupied territory? Slavery existed in what is now the Northwest Territory from the time of early exploration and settlement of that region by the French. The first slaves of the white man were Indians. Though it is true that the red man usually chose death in slavery, there were some of them that bowed to the yoke. So many Pawnee Indians became bondsmen that the word Pawnee became synonymous with slave in the West. Western Indians themselves, following the custom of the white man, enslaved their captives in war rather than choosing the alternative of putting them to death. In this way, they were known to hold a number of blacks and whites. The enslavement of the black man by the whites in this section date from the early part of the 18th century. Being part of the Louisiana Territory, which was under France, extended over the whole Mississippi Valley as far as the Allegheny Mountains. It was governed by the same colonial regulations. Slavery therefore had a legal standing in this territory. When Antoine Carteret, upon being placed in control of Louisiana, was authorized to begin a traffic in slaves, Cortez himself did nothing to carry out his plan. But in 1717, when the control of the colony was transferred to the Champagne d'Occidental, steps were taken towards the importation of slaves. In 1719, when 500 Guinea Negroes were brought over to serve in Lower Louisiana, Philip Francis Renaud imported 500 other bondsmen into Upper Louisiana and what was later to include the Northwest Territory. Slavery then became more and more insensitive until by 1750, there along the Mississippi, 5 settlements of slaves: Kaskaskia, Coahuila, Fort Charles, St. Philippe, and Prairie de Rochon. In 1763, Negroes were relatively numerous in the Northwest Territory, but this section that year was transferred to the British, a number was diminished by the action of those Frenchmen who, unwilling to become subject of Great Britain, moved from their territory. There was no material increase in the slave population thereafter until the end of the 18th century, when some Negroes came from the original 13 colonies. The Ordinance of 1787 did not disturb the relation of the slave and the master. Some pioneers thought that the Sixth Article exterminated slavery, therefore, others contend that it did not. The latter believed that such expressions in the Ordinance of 1787 as free inhabitants and the free male inhabitants of full size implied the continuance of slavery, and others found grounds for preparation in the cause of the ordinance, which allowed the people of the territory to adopt the Constitution and the laws of any one of the 13 states. Students of law saw protection for slavery in Jay's Treaty, which guarantees to the settlers their property of all kinds. When therefore the slave question came up in the Northwest Territory about the close of the 18th century, there were three classes of slaves. First, those who were in the service of the French owners previous to secession of the territory to England and were still claimed as property in possession of which the owners were protected under the Treaty of 1763. Second, those who were held by the British owners at the same time of Dray Treaty and claimed afterwards as property under its protection. And third, those who, since the territory had been controlled by the United States, had brought from the Commonwealth in which slavery was allowed. Freedom, however, was recognized as the ultimate status of the Negro in that territory. These questions have seemingly settled. Anthony Besant, for years who advocated the abolition of slavery and devoted his time and the means to the preparation of the Negro for living as free men, was practical enough to recommend to Congress of the Confederation a plan of colonizing the emancipated blacks on Western lands. Jefferson incorporated his scheme into the modern system of public schools, the training of the slaves in industrial and agricultural branches to equip them for a higher station in life. He believed, however, that blacks, not being equals to the white race, should not be assimilated, and should they be free, they should by all means be colonized afar off. That's Thomas Jefferson. Thinking that the Western lands might be used so, he said in his writing to James Monroe in 1801, a very great extent of the country north of Ohio has been laid off in townships and is now at market. According to the provision of the Act of Congress, there is nothing, he said, which will restrain the state of Virginia either in purchase or the application of these lands. Yet he raised the question as whether the establishment of such a colony within our limits and to become part of the Union would be desirable. He thought then of procuring a place beyond the limits of the United States on our northern boundary by purchasing Indian lands with the consent of Great Britain. He then doubted that the black race would live in such a rigorous climate. This plan did not easily pass from minds of the friends of the slaves, for in 1805, Thomas Brannigan asserted in his serious remonstrances that the government should appropriate a few thousand acres of land at a distant part of the national domains for the Negro accommodation and support. He believed that the new state might be established up to 2,000 miles from our frontier. A copy of the pamphlet containing this proposition was sent to Thomas Jefferson, who was impressed thereby, but not having the courage to brave the torture of being branded as a friend of the slaves, he failed to give it his support. The same question was brought proudly before the public again in 1816, when there was presented to the House of Representatives a memorial from the Kentucky Abolition Society, praying that free people of color be colonized on public lands. The committee to whom the memorial was referred for consideration reported that it was expedient to refuse the request on the grounds that, as such lands were not guaranteed to the free white man, it saw no reason for granting them to others. Some Negro slaves, unwilling to wait to be carried or invited to the Northwest Territory, escaped to that section, even when it was controlled by the French prior to the American Revolutions. Slaves who reached the West by this route caused trouble between the French and the British colonists. Advertising in 1746 for James Wyndham, a slave, Richard Colgate, his master, said he swore to a Negro whom he endeavored to induce to go with him that he had often been in the backwoods with his masters, and that he would go to the French and Indians and fought for them. In an advertisement for a mulatto slave in 1755, Thomas Ringold, his master, expressed fear that he had escaped by the same route to the French. He therefore said, "It seems to be the interest, at least of every gentleman, that his slaves to be active in the beginning of such attempts. For while we have the French such as near neighbors, we shall not have the least security in that kind of property." The good treatment which these slaves received among the French, especially at Pittsburgh, the gateway to the Northwest Territories, tend to make the city an asylum for those slaves who had sufficient spirit of adventure to brave the wilderness through which they had to go. Negroes even had the idea that there was in this country a place for more privileged than those who enjoyed the seaboard colonies. Knowing the likelihood of the Negroes to rise during the French and Indian War, Governor Dinwiddie wrote Fox, one of the Secretaries of State, in 1756, "We dare not venture to part with any of our white men at any distance, as we must have a watchful eye over our Negro slaves, who upward of 100,000. Let me read this one more time. Governor Dinwiddie wrote Fox, the Secretaries of State, one of the Secretaries of State, in 1756. We dare not venture to part with any of our white men at any distance, as we must have a watchful eye over our Negro slaves, who are upward of 100,000. Damn. Bristow de Warren mentions in his travels of 1788 several examples of marriages of whites and blacks in Pittsburgh. He noticed the case of a Negro who married an indentured French servant woman. Out of this union came a desirable mulatto girl who married a surgeon of Nazis then stationed in Pittsburgh. His family was considered one of the most respectable of the city. The Negro referred to was doing incredible business, and his wife took it upon herself to welcome foreigners, especially French, who came that way. Along the Ohio, there were several cases of colored women living with unmarried white men. But this was looked upon by Negroes as detestable. Let me read this again. Along the Ohio, there were several cases of colored women living with unmarried white men. But this was looked upon by the Negroes as detestable, as evidenced by the fact that if a black woman had a quarrel with a mulatto woman, the former would reproach the latter for being of ignoble blood. These tendencies, however, could not assure the Negro that the Northwest Territory was to be an asylum for freedom when in 1763 it passed into the hands of the British. The promoters of the slave trade, and later to the independent colonies, two of which had no desire to exterminate slavery. Furthermore, when the Ordinance of 1787, with its famous sixth article against slavery, was proclaimed, it was soon discovered that this document was not necessarily emancipatory, as the right to hold slaves was guaranteed to those who owned them prior to the passage of the Ordinance of 1787. It was to be expected that those attached to that institution would not indifferently see it pass away. Various petitions, therefore, were sent to the territorial legislature and to Congress, praying that the sixth article of the Ordinance of 1787 be abrogated. No formal action to this effect was taken, but the practice of slavery continued even at the winking of the government. Some slaves came from Canadians who, in accordance with the slave trade laws of the British Empire, supplied them with bondsmen. It was the Canadians themselves who provided an act of parliament in 1793 from prohibiting the importation of slaves and the gradual emancipation. When it seemed later that the cause of freedom would eventually triumph, the pro-slavery element undertook and perpetuated slavery through a system of indentured servant labor. In the formation of the states of Indiana and Illinois, the question as what should become done to harmonize with the new Constitution, the system of indenture to which the territorial legislators have been committed, caused a heated debate and at almost times conflict. Both in Indiana and Illinois finally incorporated into their Constitution compromise provisions for the normal prohibition of slavery, modified by the clauses of the continuation of the system of indentured labor of the Negroes held to the service. The pro-slavery party persistently struggled for some years to secure by interpretation of the laws by legislation, and even by amendments the Constitution so to change the fundamental law as to provide for actual slavery. These states, however, gradually worked towards the freedom in keeping with the spirit of the majority who framed the Constitution. Despite the fact that the indentured servant system in Southern Illinois, and especially Indiana, was at times tantamount to slavery as it was practiced in parts of the South. It must be borne in mind here, however, that the North at this time was far becoming a refuge for Negroes. In the first place, the Industrial Revolution had not had the time to reduce the Negroes to the plane of beasts in the Cotton Kingdom. The rigorous climate and the industries of the northern people, moreover, was not inviting to the blacks in the development of carrying the trade. And the rise of manufacturing there did not make that section more attractive to unskilled labor. Furthermore, when we consider the fact that there were many thousands of Negroes in southern states, and that the presence of a few in the North must be regarded as insignificant, this paucity of blacks then attained, especially in the Northwest Territory, for its French inhabitants, instead of being an exploited people, were pioneering and having little use for slaves and carrying out their policy of merely holding the country for France. Furthermore, certain gentlemen from Virginia, who after the American Revolution were afraid to bring their slaves with them to occupy their bound lands in Ohio, few enterprising settlers from the states, slaves, had invaded the territory with their Negroes, not knowing whether or not they would be secure in possession of such property. When we consider that in 1810, there were 100,231 to 37 Negroes in the North and no more than 3,400 in Northwest Territory, we must look at the second decade of the 19th century for the beginning of the migration of Negroes in the United States. Now, let me read that number again. When we consider that in 1810, there are only 100,000 Negroes in the North, right? Generally about 100,000 Negroes in the North, and there were no more than 3,400 in the Northwest Territory. So when we talk about the North in this aspect, we still talking about the 13 colonies. But in the North, there was 100,000 Negroes in the North and 3,400 in the Northwest Territories. So, we got to keep on pushing on. But that's, like I said, a refuge for freedom. That should be chapter 1. We'll get into chapter 2 a little bit later on in the next video. But that's, that's the ancestor Carter G. Woodson dropping knowledge on it, and how the city of Pittsburgh, when the French had it, was an escape for the slaves, and the slaves should escape there, and they would intermarry with different, intermarry and things of that nature. Also how, too, the French during the earlier times and the British were used to Pawnee Indians for slaves. But that's the lessons from our ancestor Carter G. Woodson. You know, we'll kick more history like this. We'll get more deeper to things like this, you know, because this is a book that got to be discussed and got to be heard about. So hope I get to see you here for chapter 2. You know, subscribe to this to the channel, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. You know, and you want to donate to the cause of the movement, hit that, you know, Cash App or Koski. You know what I'm saying? Peace. We'll be back at it again.